to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 105, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. This will be the last podcast episode of 2025. We're already halfway through December, although you wouldn't know it to look out my window. We had some snow a few weeks ago, and the past week or so, we've been getting the leftovers of those atmospheric rivers that are pointed at Seattle. Sometimes they make it this far inland and sometimes they don't. And this year, we're getting a taste of the Pineapple Express here in Montana. It has been warm in the upper 40s and 50s and raining, so we don't have much snow left on the ground. Although I think that's going to change this week. The current atmospheric river that's coming in is going to hit some cold air coming down from Canada, and it looks like we're going to have a white Christmas. So that's your weather report from the northwest corner of Montana. I came back from Tacoma and my class at the Sewing and Design School just before Thanksgiving with every intention of running up another muslin and perhaps making myself a dress using that pattern, but my good intentions went by the wayside because some new fabric came into the quilt store. Our owner's daughter, Ashley, is the operations manager at the quilt store, and she does a fabulous job of hunting down new and interesting fabrics. And she knows that I like to teach garment classes, so she's been ordering more garment fabrics. And one of the lines that she ordered was Anna Maria Perry's narrative line. And in that line were 3 fabrics that are triple gauzes. So if you've ever sewn with double gauze, a lot of baby items get made out of double gauze. It's a nice lightweight fabric for summer babies. Some people also like to make dresses out of it because it's a cool fabric. And by cool, I mean temperature-wise. The Anna Maria Perry fabrics are a triple gauze, so it's one additional layer. And it's just like it sounds. You know the gauze that you put on wounds that you use as bandages? It's very similar to that. And the 3 layers are woven in such a way that they are interconnected. This was a heftier fabric than a lot of the double gauzes that I've seen, and I thought it would make a great jacket. When you start making garments, one of the tricky concepts to get your head around is fabrication, meaning that not every fabric works for every garment. I ran into this when I was teaching knitting too, because people tend to choose fabric based on color, not on structure. And people would come into the yarn store and spot a red yarn that they absolutely fell in love with, and they would want to make a sweater, but they wouldn't always match the yarn to the correct pattern. There's a little wiggle room here. You can make an Aran sweater or a cabled sweater out of a cotton yarn, but it's a little bit more difficult than making it out of a wool yarn or an acrylic yarn. So you can break the rules, but it helps if you know when it's appropriate to break the rules. So I looked at this fabric and I thought this would make a nice jacket, but I also recognized that it needed to be a very unconstructed jacket. It needed to have simple lines. It needed to not have any complicated details. So I went looking for a pattern, and I settled on the Tremont jacket from the sewing workshop. The triple gauze from Anna Maria reminded me very much of a hand-woven fabric, and I had seen many examples of the Tremont jacket made up in hand-woven type fabrics, so I was pretty confident that it would work. And it did. The trickiest part of that pattern is mitered corners. So on the front and back, there are mitered corners, and they're an acute angle, not a 90-degree angle. Also, when you're making the miter, one side is a double fold hem and the other side is a single fold hem. So it's a bit tricky. The instructions are reasonably good. I practiced on some scrap fabric until I was confident that I could do it. And I'm very happy with the way my mitered corners came out. I will also say that triple gauze needs to be finished before you start handling it. So as soon as you cut the fabric out, cut the pattern pieces out, it would probably behoove you to run them through the serger. Otherwise, triple gauze starts to fray like nobody's business. Beyond that, the jacket is dead simple. It's a front, a back, another front, and the fronts are asymmetrical, and then 2 sleeves. So it went together very quickly. And I think you'll be able to see photos of that on Instagram this week. My only quibble with the pattern is that it didn't specify how to make the single buttonhole at the front. I found a vintage button in my button stash that I thought matched the jacket really well, but the instructions only said make a buttonhole. It didn't say make a vertical buttonhole or make a horizontal buttonhole. So I actually split the difference and made a buttonhole on a 45-degree angle because the front of the jacket is kind of on a 45-degree angle, and so that made it more of a horizontal type buttonhole. I think if I were going to do this again, I would probably do a vertical buttonhole. But it worked. The fit of the jacket is amazing. I would probably lengthen it a little bit next time, but I lengthen everything because my torso is so long. It's fine the way it is, and I'll wear the jacket. It's like a big hug. The fabric is very cozy, and everyone at the fabric store who's tried it on so far has really liked it. So that was a detour I wasn't intending to take, but I'm happy that I did. I felt very accomplished after I finished that jacket because it was a tricky fabric to work with, and there were some tricky parts to the pattern, but I managed to deal with those, and I did that without even making a muslin. Today, I've been working on class samples. We're going to do a class on Sew House 7's Burnside bibs, and I need to make a class sample for that. I enjoy making class samples, but it does tend to mess up my personal planning a little bit when it comes to sewing projects, but I don't mind because I'm sewing. So let's talk about today's episode. When I get more than 2 emails about a particular topic, I know that it's probably time to do an episode on that topic. Even if I've done an episode in the past, I certainly don't expect people to go back and binge listen to 100 episodes. So I may start recycling some topics, but that's okay. We can put a new spin on things. We can add additional information. And the one question that I've been getting quite a bit lately is, how do I begin quilting? Quilting is a huge industry and it continues to grow. And I think that the popularity of quilting is due to the fact that it results in something utilitarian but also beautiful. So if you're someone who wants to create art for art's sake, you can use quilting as a way to make quilted art. If you are one of those people who would prefer that your creative energies go toward making something useful, clearly a quilt is going to be useful. It will keep someone warm. And neither of those things is better than the other. They're just different facets of the same activity. I was attracted to quilting because, well, for 2 reasons. Actually, for several reasons, now that I think about it. I belong to a Mennonite church, and if you know anything about the Mennonite ladies and the Amish ladies, quilting is in their DNA. And I would see the beautiful items that the ladies from our church were making, and I really wanted to learn how to quilt. They typically hand quilted, and unfortunately, we don't quilt much anymore because the older ladies who were doing it have either passed away or have arthritis and can't quilt, and the younger ladies, very few of them wanted to learn how to hand quilt. But I would go to our monthly quilting sessions, and it was a way to foster community. It was a way to contribute to something. We did a lot of quilting for other people. So learning to quilt from them was one of the reasons that I wanted to take that up as a hobby. Another reason was I have a spot over the stairwell of the stairs leading to our second floor, and it was a huge empty spot, and I would go up the stairs or come down the stairs and think, I'd really like to have a quilt to hang up there to fill that spot. And here's the funny part of that story. It took 10 years for me to fill that spot with a quilt. I kept thinking that I would start quilting and that would be one of my first projects, and it wasn't. It took me a long time to make something to fill that spot. But now I have something hanging up there and I love it. The last reason that I wanted to learn how to quilt was because I wanted to sew, but I didn't feel confident enough yet to begin making garments for myself. About the only sewing I had done up to that point that were any kind of garments were Halloween costumes for my children, and they weren't very choosy. So I saw quilting as a way to get into sewing without having to worry about fitting, because quilts fit everybody. If you're hesitating to take up quilting, ask yourself what's standing in your way. Are you worried that you're not artistic enough? Are you worried that you can't sew a straight seam? Are you worried you're going to make a mess of it? Think about what's holding you back, or what you feel like your personal hurdle is. And let's see if we can address some of those concerns. So if you don't think you're artistic enough, put that out of your head. Everyone, every single person has artistic capability. And I tell you that as a person who cannot draw a picture to save her life. One of my personal big hurdles was I never felt when I was a knitting designer that I had a good sense of color. I always felt like putting colors together was a struggle for me. And amazingly, that kind of went away when I started quilting. If you're worried that you're going to mess something up, don't be. That's why we have seam rippers. And all of us have had to rip out a seam or 2 or 10. I tell students in my sewing classes that this is not brain surgery and no one's going to die if we mess something up. You may be very excited to make a quilt, and when you get it done, you may decide that you don't like it. That's happened to me. Something that I thought when I went into it was going to be something that I absolutely would love and cherish ended up being donated because I just wasn't feeling it by the end of the project. And that's okay. There's lots of reasons why people fall out of love with a project, but just remember that you're creating something utilitarian as well. And it doesn't really matter if you don't like it. It will keep someone warm. One of the nice things about crafting today, and it doesn't matter what kind of crafting you're talking about, the entry points are a lot easier to find, and the barriers to entry are a lot lower than they used to be. You can watch YouTube, you can take an online class, you can take a class at a quilt store, you could take a class at a community college, you could find a local maker space. There are many ways to jump in and get started. I was inspired by Elizabeth Hartman's book, The Practical Guide to Patchwork. That was probably the very first quilting book that I picked up, and it was like falling down a rabbit hole. Elizabeth presented a series of quilt patterns that were accessible to beginners, and they didn't look like what I thought of with your typical quilt in old-fashioned calicos. She designed her quilts using bright colors and modern prints. Your first quilt doesn't even need to come from a pattern. All you need to do is cut squares. At our church, we make comforter tops out of 5-inch squares. And if you don't want to cut 5-inch squares, you can buy charm packs. You can buy pre-cut 5-inch squares in a variety of patterns. And all you have to do is sew those squares together. It is literally as simple as that. Buy a couple of packages of charm squares and make a quilt. That will give you a jump start because you won't have to cut the pieces, and you'll have the opportunity to practice your 1/4-inch seams. I'm going to stop here and note that the process of making a quilt involves 2 different activities. We have a joke at my church that some of us are piecers and some of us are quilters. I fall into the former category. I love to piece. If you are a piecer, make friends with a quilter. If you are a quilter, make friends with a piecer. I have a friend who loves to quilt, and I ended up with more quilt tops than I knew what to do with, and she was quite happy to take them and quilt them. So for the moment, I'm going to focus on piecing, but we're also going to talk about quilting a little bit later. By the time you make your first quilt with 5-inch squares or 10-inch squares or whatever you've decided to use, you're probably going to be itching to move on to something slightly more complicated. And that's why I really like that Elizabeth Hartman book, because she had designs that were interesting to make but weren't so complicated that you would lose interest or get frustrated by the end of the quilt. And making something over and over and over is good practice and cements the muscle memory. So after squares, perhaps you want to move on to half square triangles, where you've got 2 triangles together that make a square. Or perhaps you want to do a rail fence quilt, which is strips of fabric sewn together into a square, and then the squares are sewn together, but you rotate every other square 90 degrees. I wouldn't leap into a drunkard's path quilt or a New York beauty quilt just yet. And maybe you're a person who feels confined by geometric shapes, in which case improvisational piecing might be right up your alley. My friend JC, who was the technical editor for my knitting magazine and for my books, took up quilting, and she gravitated right toward improvisational quilting. And she has done some of the most interesting projects. And while improv quilting isn't something that I want to try, I can see why it's so attractive for her. Let's talk a little bit about what you need to get started in terms of equipment. You need a sewing machine, probably, although that's not a requirement. I do know people who quilt by hand. One of the staff members at the store where I teach is doing Jen Kingwell's pick-a-pedal pattern, and it's completely hand-pieced. But I think most newbies are probably going to want to use a sewing machine. You do not need anything fancy. I have made quilts on the Janome Hello Kitty sewing machine that I took to my daughter's house in Alaska. When I'm here at home, I do most of my quilt piecing on an 80-year-old Italian sewing machine that I bought from someone who had it in their storage unit. It belonged to her aunt, who was a seamstress in the 40s. You don't need a fancy sewing machine. In terms of cutting, you might think that you need a rotary cutter and a mat, but truly there was a time when people cut templates out of cardboard cereal boxes and traced around them on their fabric and cut those pieces out, and that's how they quilted. I will not lie, rotary cutting is faster, it's more efficient, it's more accurate, but you absolutely can cut quilt pieces and units out of fabric using nothing more than a pair of scissors. If you are going to use a mat and a rotary cutter, you'll also need at least one ruler. I have an 8x24 that I use when I need to cut strips of fabric. I have several smaller rulers. I have a 6x12 ruler that I really like. You can absolutely go nuts with the rulers. There are specialty rulers for just about everything out there. But don't start buying specialty rulers until you need them because things can get expensive quickly. You will need fabric. Fabric is the backbone of quilting. I'm disappointed that I can't recommend Joann Fabrics anymore. I built my stash by going to one of the local quilt stores, which put fat quarters on sale every Friday. And a fat quarter is a quarter yard piece of fabric that is about 18 inches by 21 inches instead of being 9 inches by 44 inches if you cut a quarter yard off the bolt. The other way I built my fabric stash was to buy remnants at Joann's. You can get remnants at Hobby Lobby if you want to go that route. A lot of quilt stores also sell remnants. As I mentioned before, you can get pre-cuts where the fabric's already cut for you. The interesting thing to me about quilting is that you need less fabric than you think you do. Very rarely do you need yardage for anything besides backgrounds and quilt backs. The rest of the time you can use scraps, you can use fat quarters, you can use remnants, you can swap fabrics with friends. I have a quilt on my bed that has some pieces of fabric that I swapped with a friend of mine on the East Coast, and every time I look at them, I'm reminded of her. I have the same philosophy about fabric that I do about yarn, and that is to buy the best quality that you can afford. I try not to mix my Joann Fabrics fabric with quilt store fabric because usually I can tell the difference. There is a difference in quality, but fabric is expensive, and I'm probably not going to use $13 or $14 a yard quilt store fabric for a quilt that may end up being donated. So buy the best quality that you can afford. I would rather people quilt with Walmart fabric than not quilt at all. And I don't think it serves the community to be a snob and to look down on people who perhaps can't afford to shop in a certain price range. I will also give you this little piece of advice that was given to me. You might wonder as you're choosing fabrics or shopping for fat quarters and building your fabric stash, how do I know what goes together? You will tend to gravitate toward the same kinds of fabrics over and over again. If you really like modern types of fabrics, those are the ones that you're going to buy and put in your stash. I tend to go for retina burning bright colors, so my stash is full of things that a parrot would wear. I have other types of fabrics in there just to spice things up a little bit, but I know that I can pretty much go to my stash and pull a bunch of fabrics, and they're going to go together because those are the kinds of fabrics that I gravitate toward. You are going to need a way to maintain an accurate 1/4 inch seam when you are quilting or when you are piecing your quilt. And again, you can spend a lot of money and buy fancy 1/4 inch piecing feet. But there are many different types out there, and you really need to probably experiment with the different kinds before you commit to one or the other. And honestly, the simplest solution is to use a piece of painter's tape or a seam guide, or even if you have a throat plate that has 1/4 inch markings, you can use the 1/4 inch marking on your throat plate, although that requires you to pay a little bit closer attention to make sure that you're actually on that mark. The goal is to be consistent. And don't be surprised if you have some variability in your first project or your first couple of projects. You might have sections of the quilt top where you pieced with a super accurate 1/4 inch seam, and you might have other parts where maybe you used a different foot or you weren't quite feeling it that day, and maybe your 1/4 inch seam is a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. It happens to all of us. An accurate 1/4 inch seam is something to shoot for, but don't beat yourself up over it. Along with fabric, I would also buy a good quality thread. And here you have several choices. You can use cotton, you can use polyester, you can use a cotton wrapped polyester. I think the cotton wrapped polyester would probably be my choice for beginners because you get the strength of polyester with the appearance of cotton. But some people like to use cotton exclusively and piece with cotton thread because they're using cotton fabric. If you like to watch videos, I would recommend watching lots of videos. There are a million ways to piece a block, and you will find out that the way that one person does it may not be the way that you prefer to do it. I have a particular method that I like to use for making flying geese units. Somebody else might use a different method. And again, it's not that one is better or worse than the other. It's just what people prefer. Let's talk a little bit about community. Quilting, by its very nature, has always been something of a community activity. I talked about quilting with the Mennonite ladies at my church. Our quilt store has a youngish quilters group. There is also an older-ish quilters group that meets on Thursdays and works on projects. You might want to join an online community of quilters. The benefits of being with other quilters are enormous. You learn so much because, as I said, everyone has different ways of doing things. So you might learn a new technique for piecing half-square triangles. You might learn about new fabrics, new patterns. You can get help when you're struggling. And one of the things that I think is great is accountability. You can have a group that checks in with each other to find out how quilting is progressing, which is great if you get into a place where maybe you aren't feeling it. Some groups have block swaps or round robins where everybody makes 12 blocks and each person gets 12 different blocks and then can sew those blocks into whatever pattern they like. They can all do the same pattern or they can do individual and different patterns. I am a big advocate for community of all kinds, and quilting is certainly the kind of community that can get you out of the house and get you out of your comfort zone and provide things that you maybe didn't know you needed. Okay, we've talked a lot about piecing. Let's talk about actual quilting. You've been piecing and piecing and piecing, and maybe you've made half a dozen quilt tops, and now you need to actually turn them into quilts. Once again, you don't need fancy equipment. You can hand quilt them, or you can machine quilt them, and you can machine quilt on a straight stitch sewing machine. This is where it gets maybe a little bit harder to do with a basic sewing machine. I probably wouldn't use that Janome Hello Kitty machine to quilt a quilt, but you still don't need an ultra fancy top of the line machine. You can also have someone else quilt your quilt for you. We call that quilting by checkbook, or maybe nowadays it needs to be called quilting by Venmo. If you really like the piecing part of making quilts, but you're not so enthusiastic about the quilting part, maybe farming this part out is what is the right solution for you. If you're going to learn how to do it yourself, you'll have to become conversant about batting and backings. There are lots of different battings out there. You can find 100% cotton. You can find 80-20 cotton polyester. You can get bamboo or wool or silk or recycled pop bottle batting. A lot of people associate kind of the puffy quilted comforter type bedspreads, whatever you want to call them, from the 70s and 80s with polyester batting, but you can get low loft, medium loft, or high loft batting, polyester batting. And I often use some of the low loft polyester batting, either alone or in combination with other types of batting. Again, it's a matter of deciding what kind of end result you want and working backward from there. If your quilt is anything larger than a baby quilt, you'll probably need to learn how to piece your backings or use a wide back. A wide back is a piece of fabric that is at least 108 inches wide, although I think there are some now that go up to 120 inches wide. If you don't use a wide back, you'll have to sew together two 45-inch or 44-inch wide pieces of fabric to get a backing that is wide enough for your quilt. And once you've sandwiched your quilt top with the batting in between the top and the backing, you'll have to baste it together. Some people like to use adhesive basting spray. I like to pin baste my quilts. There are a couple of different ways of doing it. It's just a matter of finding the method that you like. And then you have to decide if you're going to straight line quilt or you're going to free motion quilt, or if you're going to do some combination of the two. And I would say for your first couple of quilts, especially if you've done something where maybe you've sewn 5-inch squares together, straight line quilting is perfectly acceptable and gives you a really great look. If you're going to do some straight line quilting, you will probably want to get a walking foot for your machine if one is available, or if you don't have a machine that has an integrated walking foot. And a walking foot moves the upper fabric and lower fabric at the same rate, so it keeps the layers from shifting. You can quilt without a walking foot, but it's a lot harder to keep things together. And you might get to the end of a section of quilting and discover that things have gotten pretty skewed. A lot of my first few quilts were done with straight line quilting on my machine. I had a Janome 6600P, which is a great quilting machine, and it has an integrated walking foot, and I just did straight line quilting, usually 1/4 of an inch away from the seams. You can quilt in a method called stitch in the ditch, which is where you follow the seam line between two pieces of fabric. There are pros and cons. Sometimes I do that as well. Some people refuse to do any kind of stitch in the ditch quilting, but there are, I think, times when it's a legitimate quilting technique and one that deserves to be in your toolbox. You'll want to get comfortable with rolling up your quilt so that you can get it under the presser foot. Sometimes it helps to put up an extra table either beside or behind your machine to hold the bulk of the quilt while you're working on it. Instead of straight line quilting with a walking foot, you might choose to jump right in and do some free motion quilting. And in that case, you're probably going to need a special foot, usually called a hopping foot, and you'll need to be able to either lower the feed dogs on your machine or cover them up in some way so that they aren't grabbing the fabric. You want to be able, when you're free motion quilting, to be able to move the fabric freely in any direction. Free motion quilting takes a bit of practice, I will not lie, especially if your machine does not have any kind of stitch regulation mechanism on it, because in free motion quilting, you are controlling the length of the stitch. So you have to get used to moving the fabric at a consistent speed. Some machines have integrated stitch regulation, and some machines have a special foot, like the Bernina stitch regulator. That foot plugs into the machine and enables the machine to regulate the length of the stitches for you so that you don't have to do it. Your quilting thread may be different than your piecing thread. It really depends on what kind of look you're going for when you're quilting. I really liked my quilts to look sort of hand quilted, So I typically use a slightly thicker cotton thread to quilt mine. I've also used polyester and rayon threads to quilt, and it depends on what kind of end result you're looking for. The last thing you'll need to learn how to do is how to bind your quilt when it's all finished. You're going to have a quilted piece of fabric that has some raw edges, and typically you would trim those edges down so that the quilt is square, binding encloses and protects the raw edges. Again, you can bind by hand, you can bind by machine. It's what you want to do with your quilt. I would search out some help binding your first quilt. I didn't have any help binding my first quilt, and it was quite a trial to me. So get a more experienced quilter to help you with this part of it. You're at the final step of your quilt and you don't want to mess it up. You want it to look good, and you want to be able to finish off that project in which you invested so much time so that you have a useful object or something beautiful to hang on the wall for years to come. I think my best advice is to start small. You don't even have to make a quilt as your first project. Make a pillow. Make a wall hanging. You want quick wins that give you the encouragement to keep moving forward. And honestly, that's probably why it took 10 years for me to actually get a quilt to hang over the stairwell in my house, because I went into this thinking, oh, how hard could it be? And discovered that in order to do what I wanted to do, I had to learn quite a bit. I still like piecing, but I've developed an affinity now for quilting. I have a Bernina Q20 quilting machine, and there are days when quilting a piece of fabric with some batting and backing is the most relaxing thing that I can think of doing. If you can sew a seam, though, you can make a quilt. It's really that simple. I think you'll be surprised at how quickly you improve. And even if you end up not making quilts, knowing the process of quilting will allow you to make quilted bags, pot holders, home deck items. There are tons and tons of places where you would use quilting even though you're not making a quilt. Keep a quilt journal, set up an Instagram page, have a blog, someplace where you can post pictures and see your achievements and see your growth. I have a dear friend who was a member of our church who is 99 years old, and she still quilts. In fact, she asked several of us if we could send her quilt tops to quilt. She lives in another state now, and she would be happy to put them in her quilt frame in her apartment and hand quilt them and send them back to us. And I remember that when she lived here, she kept little photo albums of every single quilt she made with the pertinent details. And I thought, what a wonderful record of her life. I like to tell my students to stop and admire their work every so often because they're doing something pretty cool. So if you haven't yet taken the leap into quilting and you'd like to, don't overthink it. If you can sew a seam, you can make a quilt. Hopefully I didn't miss anything glaringly obvious. If you have questions, please let me know. I love to get feedback, and as I said, this topic came up on several different emails, and that's why I thought that it was important to do an episode about it. This will be the last episode of 2025. I'm going to take the last 2 weeks of December off and hopefully get a fair bit of sewing done. I have quite a few projects in the queue. Feedback is always welcome. Suggestions for future episodes or for people that you'd like me to interview, those suggestions are always welcome too. Even if it's something that I've done a podcast episode on in the past, I don't mind revisiting topics because, as I said, not everybody wants to go back and listen to all the previous episodes. and I may have additional information to share. You can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. You can visit the website. The podcast website is www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com, and that's where I have the show notes for each episode. My personal website is www.janetzabo.com. That's where I have links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website and to my blog, which is where I post 3 or 4 times a week about what I'm working on, things that are happening here in Montana. Not so much in the winter, but in the spring and summer, I tend to post pictures of cute chicks and baby piglets. You can also use the fan mail feature at the beginning of each podcast episode download. I can't respond directly to those, but I do try to respond to comments and to emails. So I will be back again in 2026. And until then, I hope that you have a joyful holiday season, however you celebrate, and that you get to go sew something.